Today I'm going to talk about the minimum wage, and I'd like to just before that speak about what an important issue it is. One of my first jobs was at the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, working under President Ronald Reagan, and I was a junior staff economist there. And then I've also worked in the White House under George H.W. Bush in a small group that did domestic policy. That was in 1991 to 1993. And I was chief of staff of the Council of Economic Advisors. That's a group of economists that advises the president under George W. Bush. And then I was chief economist of the Labor Department. And in all these positions, the question of the minimum wage came up, because people were always thinking, we want to help the poor. Why don't we raise the wage that employers have to pay people? And in the United States, it's just a continual issue. 2 weeks ago, I was in a debate at the City Museum in New York, the Museum of the City of New York. And it was me against 4 other people, all of whom were interested in raising the minimum wage. One of the participants was a New York Times journalist who'd written a series about manicure salons in the New York Times. And she was very proud of the fact that her article had caused a crackdown on these manicure salons so that many of them had closed. She didn't seem to be aware that these new immigrants didn't have very many other opportunities for employment. And what she'd done was just deprived a lot of people who couldn't speak English, mostly Koreans and Vietnamese, of their first rung on the job ladder in the United States. Well, in Israel now, the minimum wage is 25 shekels an hour. It's going to go up next year to 26 shekels, 27 shekels the year afterwards. And in contrast, in April 1997, it was about 12 shekels an hour. So what this slide shows is the minimum wage in Israel relative both to the mean and the median income. Well, the agreement between the Histadrut, the Manufacturers Association of Israel, and the Israeli government stipulates that going forward, the minimum wage will be tied to 47% of Israel's median salary, and further increases will be guaranteed for growth in economic productivity. The agreement doesn't have the force of law, but since the Histadrut and the Manufacturers Association control a large number of employees, it will affect between around 600 and 700,000 workers, which could be about 15 to 20% of employees. So President Netanyahu praised the increase in the minimum wage, claiming that the increase reflects our desire to help all segments of the economy. And at the beginning of this seminar, I'd like to ask all of you, how many of you think the minimum wage helps poor workers? Why don't you raise your hand? Yeah, so almost all of you think that it would be helpful to raise the minimum wage. So, it's a very compassionate thing to want to do, to want to help people. And the problem is that when you raise the minimum wage, people who are low skill find it difficult to get their first job. And you find unemployment is higher among low skill and young workers. In this book that just came out, that I wrote, it's called Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young. I have sections on the minimum wage and how it particularly disadvantages young workers. Most people earn above minimum wage. but the people who don't are mostly the young and people who get hurt and people who don't have any other skills. So here's a graph of the hourly minimum wage in Israel in current shekels. And here's the hourly minimum wage in a constant rate. In other words, adjusting for inflation. The logic of the minimum wage seems to be encapsulated by Avi Nissenkorn, the current chairman of Histadrut, who stated that the April 2015 increase in the minimum wage is a move aimed at raising productivity in Israel, which is 23% lower than the OECD average, and that there is significant correlation between the level of productivity and the level of wages. Mr. Nissenkorn has a point on labor productivity. Israel's labor productivity is well below those of other Western countries and well below the OECD average. But as the Taub Center, one of the best economic centers here, has pointed out, it's labor productivity that drives wages upwards, not the reverse. For example, Israelis worked on average more than those in the G7, yet their wages rose at a much slower pace. The slower rise is due to the lack of skills that segments of the Israeli population have not yet attained. All of you, of course, are going to have jobs well above minimum wage, but it's people who don't have an education that need those jobs. The Ministry of Finance points out that output per employee affects directly the average standard of living. Some of the reasons the Ministry of Finance thinks that labor productivity is low in Israel includes the average working experience per worker, the relatively young age of the working population. Since military service results in people going into the labor force later, they have less experience. The scope of the shadow economy also affects Israel's productivity numbers because unreported economic activity is not included in the national accounts and therefore reduces the labor productivity by official employees. 20% of Israel's GDP, some people calculate, is in the shadow economy, and raising the minimum wage will drive more people underground into the shadow economy. One example of how the minimum wage would eliminate workers is the Thai migrants. There are about 22,000 Thai migrants, people from Thailand, who currently work at the minimum wage, and these are people who wouldn't be employed if the minimum wage were raised. There's also 130,000 Ethiopians living here in Israel, and about 52% live below the poverty line, with only 65% of them being employed. And they would be also people who would be hurt by a minimum wage increase. If employers had to pay more, they would skip the Ethiopians, they would skip the Thais, and these people wouldn't have any way of making a living. Well, it's not just in Israel. In Israel, the minimum wage affects more people, but it's a very, very big question in the United States. Now the federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 an hour, which is about 28 shekels. It went up from $5.15 in 3 steps from 2007 to 2009. So that's about 20 shekels. And other cities and states have their own minimum wages. And there's a great debate in the United States now as to whether cities have the right to set their own minimum wages. It would be here as though Tel Aviv said that its wage was going to be higher than the rest of the country. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, and some other cities, New York, for its fast food workers, they have a minimum wage of $15 an hour, which is about 58 shekels. And President Obama used to say that he wanted a minimum wage of $10 an hour, about 38 shekels, and now he says he wants $12 an hour, which is about 46 shekels. Well, when you look at the proponents of the minimum wage, their argument is that if you raise wages, if you make employers pay more, it doesn't have any effects on employment. One of the main economists who argues this is Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for international economics. And he's also now a columnist for the New York Times. He used to be a professor at Princeton University. And he says, quote, "There's just no evidence that raising the minimum wage costs jobs." So if raising the minimum wage were cost-free, if he were right, then why stop at $15 an hour? Why not go straight to, say, $25 an hour, which is the average wage in the US economy? Or why not go to $30 or $40 or $50 an hour? I think all of you realize that having a big increase in the minimum wage would cost jobs. But just in the same way, a small increase also would have the same effect. The answer is that some people with low skills are displaced at any particular wage. Well, let's look at the studies that Paul Krugman cites. I'm just going to very briefly review it. It's an academic study by University of California professor David Card and Princeton University professor Alan Kruger. And as you heard yesterday, you shouldn't believe everything you read. You shouldn't believe everything that you read in studies. And these two professors produced a study, in fact, two studies, of the effects of raising the minimum wage on fast food restaurants in New Jersey in 1992. They concluded that raising the minimum wage had no effect on employment in New Jersey. They compared it with a neighboring state, Pennsylvania. The studies published in 1994 and 2000 basically have been used as the basis for people saying that raising minimum wages doesn't do any harm. But the studies have a number of problems. They didn't include information on the percent of workers at the minimum wage at any date in time. They didn't give any information on whether the minimum wage law was binding or what the sample was. They didn't include information by county, such as income, unemployment, teen unemployment, labor force, and labor force participation rates. And they didn't include any information on state taxes and franchise fees. The regression statistics explained very little of the variance, and none of the coefficients were significant. Card and Kruger infer that minimum wage policy makes no difference, but a better explanation is that the equation excluded important variables. Card and Kruger focused exclusively on fast food establishments, but many other minimum wage opportunities in the service industry, particularly the hospitality industry, are also affected. Well, there are other economic studies that come to different conclusions. The National Bureau of Economic Research published a paper in late December by two University of California professors, Jeffrey Clemens and Michael Wither, and they found that minimum wage increases were responsible for about 14% of the decline in the working age population in the United States employed between 2006 and 2012. What they did was they looked at the minimum wage increase that I described earlier between 2007 and 2009, and they used that to calculate what effect the minimum wage has. What they did was they looked at the change in the minimum wage across states that have different minimum wage laws. So in the United States, there's a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. But individual states, and there are 50 states, are allowed to have their own minimum wages. So they could see whether the minimum wage was binding or not. In other words, if, for example, New York City had an $8.50 minimum wage, then the $7.25 minimum wage isn't binding. If you have a minimum wage above what the federal level is, then if you raise the federal minimum wage, it doesn't have any effect. And that's what these two professors did. They used data from the 2008 Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a data set on a lot of individuals and how much they earn and whether they're employed or not. So they found that some low-skilled workers who earned the old minimum wage were employed at the new minimum wage, but they found that the minimum wage increase substantially reduced employment. By the second year after the $7.25 minimum wage went into effect, they estimated that the employment of low-skilled workers had declined by about 6 percentage points, or 8% more in states with a binding minimum wage. They then examined teenagers and food service workers, and they found that their employment declined by 4 percentage points. They found that increasing the minimum wage had a more harmful effect on states such as Texas that just had the federal minimum wage than on states such as California and New York, which had higher minimum wages. For example, an increase in the minimum wage to $12 an hour, as President Obama proposes, wouldn't affect the residents of Seattle and San Francisco because their minimum wages are already higher. It's interesting to look at the political situation in the United States, where you have the states on the coasts that have much higher minimum wages. They are arguing for an increase in the federal minimum wage because all the states in between have lower minimum wages, just the federal. So they see that their employment is leaving for states at lower wages. And so they want the rest of the country to be equally miserable. They want the rest of the country to catch up with them so that they will no longer be at a competitive disadvantage. That's why you see the politicians from each of the coasts trying to make the rest of the country catch up with them. Well, in the United States, it's difficult finding the effects of the minimum wage because 97% of the population makes more than the minimum wage. Here in Israel, the percentage of people on minimum wage is about 15 to 20%, depending on the calculations. But in the United States, it's far lower. People get a minimum wage job, and then right away they use it as a launching pad to something better. So doing empirical work on this is much more difficult. Yes, a question over here.
You said 97% of people make above minimum wage. Is that the national minimum wage, or is that the relevant minimum wage that's based on where they're living?
That's the national minimum wage, and that's 97% of employed Americans make above the minimum wage.
And how many people are, like, how many states have only minimum wage in terms of employee population?
How many have the federal minimum wage? About half of them have above the federal minimum wage. Yeah, it's approximately 50-50, and I can find you the other. I can find you the precise number later. Well, so what? The people who are hurt are primarily young people trying to get into the labor force, and New York's Governor Cuomo, pushed forward an increase just in fast food employment just earlier this year. And the fast food employment, that's eating and drinking places and fast food restaurants, he made an exception for those and said that those were the ones that should have a higher minimum wage. Even though there are other places in New York City such as gambling casinos and manicurists and other people like that. For some reason, the fast food places have been targeted by unions in the United States. And it's very interesting that they have done this, and you might want to ask why this has happened. And the unions want to try to unionize the fast food workers because there are there's a lot of turnover in fast food. People get these jobs in restaurants just very briefly for maybe a summer job, then they go back to school, or they get it, say, for part-time for a spring semester or a fall semester, and then they go back to school. And this results in a lot of turnover in the fast food industry. Well, unions are especially interested in organizing, unionizing places with fast food with high turnover because they get an initiation fee for each person who joins the union. So if there's one person who joins the union 1 year, then they get an initiation fee of $50 plus 2 to 4% of the paycheck. But if there's 3 people who have one job in 1 year, so someone comes in the spring, someone comes in the summer, someone comes in the fall, then they have $150. So the unions have been mounting a fight called Fight for 15, trying to get the minimum wage raised in many cities around the United States. And they have demonstrations. They call people out who generally are not fast food workers and get them to come and protest that the wage should be $15 an hour. Well, what is interesting is that once they have achieved that wage, they often carve out an exemption for themselves. So if you look at San Francisco, Seattle, Tacoma Park, Richmond, California, Oakland, Chicago, Milwaukee, the unions have succeeded in raising that minimum wage, but then they have a particular exemption for what they call collectively bargained agreements. That's agreements that are organized, agreements for the employer to unionize. So they go to the employer and they say, well, the minimum wage has just gone up to $15 an hour, for example, the way it is in San Francisco and Seattle. But if you sign an agreement with us, then you won't have to pay the $15 an hour. You can pay $10 to $11 an hour, and that's legal. So a lot of the focus has been on actually getting the minimum wage higher so that they can get a carve-out for themselves. And there's an immense amount of money that unions such as the SEIU, that's the Service Employees International Union, are spending on this. It's not that these people care so much about the welfare of the poor. They are doing it for propaganda purposes so they can have this exception for themselves. Then they can go to large hotels such as Marriott or Holiday Inn or McDonald's and then try to get a large number of additional union members. Well, this is because the amount of union membership in the United States has been steadily declining. It used to be about 25% in the 1980s. It's now gone down to about 11%, or about 6.7% of private sector workers. And these unions have to pay their staff. Their vice presidents and presidents are very well compensated. They also have to pay pensions for the retired workers as well as for the existing workers. So they're really desperate to get new members. So whereas it might seem as though this fight for $15 an hour on the part of the unions was made in a charitable way, in a compassionate way, in order to help people, when you look underneath and you look at the details, you find that quite the opposite is true. The pensions of these unions are very much underfunded. They don't have the funds to pay the pensions of the workers to whom they are promising better pensions. These pensions, which are evaluated every year by the Department of Labor, have only about 40 to 50% of the funds that they need in order to pay existing or retired workers. And the only way to fix this problem is to get more people to sign up. So as well as the fight for 15, the unions are also trying to get small restaurants, franchises such as McDonald's, declared joint employers with the parent company, McDonald's USA or Burger King USA, so that they can go to the parent company and say, please allow us to unionize your workforce, and then we won't cause you any trouble. So this wouldn't be so much of a problem if the youth unemployment in the United States was any better off. But as we describe in our book, in the United States, as well as in Israel, young people are having a particularly hard time. The youth unemployment for people 20 to 24 years old is about 10%, compared with about 5% for people 25 and above. The teenage unemployment rate is about 18%, and the unemployment rate for African American teens is about 30%. And these are the group of people with the least skills who would be the most hurt by increases in the minimum wage. In the United States, half the minimum wage workers are under 25, and about 21% of these are teens. Well, I think that with that, I think I would like to open this to discussion, and I want to hear your thoughts and see what you think about the minimum wage and whether you understand the implications it has for unskilled workers, such in New York as the Korean and Vietnamese manicurists trying to get into the labor force, and also the equivalent problems here with the Thai and the Ethiopian workers. Yes?
I have two questions. First of all, do you think there's a different way in Israel where you have people to the army? First of all, the whole issue of the difference between the United States is pretty much that you have college there, pretty much fast out. Other people do have somewhat of an experience that they could use later on in life, they get into the army, and a lot of people do, especially people that are coming from hard backgrounds. Second of all,
well, how about if I answer one at a time, and then I'll get the next question. So I think that when you're in the Army, there are some jobs in the Army, in fact, many jobs that give certain amount of skills that allow people to earn above minimum wage afterwards. And I think these are not people that we have to worry about. As we heard yesterday, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker that we get our meat and bread. Employers pay people more than minimum wage, not because they are forced to do so, but because that's the only way they can retain them. If, for example, someone offered you a minimum wage job, you would say, well, no, I can earn more, and you would go to a different kind of employer. And most people who leave the Army would be in that position, and they would be able to do that. But if you have someone who's just come into the country, say someone from Thailand, someone from Ethiopia, someone who doesn't have any skills, those are the people who would be forced out of the labor market by the high minimum wage. So this is not a concern of the average worker. This is a concern of people trying to get into the labor market. In the United States, we have, it's not a system, it's not a tradition, but many teens want to get jobs during the summer. The summer vacations are very long. Kids get out of school in June, beginning of June. They don't go back till the beginning of September. There's 3 months, and many of them want to get summer jobs. So increases in the minimum wage would fall disproportionately on them. And in our book, we interview many young people. We also interview some business people. We have the story of someone called Linda Mack, a real person who runs Silver Cycles in Silver Spring, Maryland. And she had an internship for teens, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, that paid $7.25 an hour during the summer. She is somewhat to the left of President Obama. She's very left-wing. But she says she couldn't have her internship program if the minimum wage were to go to $10, $12, $15 an hour. Because she says the first year, these 15-year-olds can't really do anything except point the cyclist towards a bicycle pump and, you know, figure out where everything is and maybe learn the rudiments of, you know, changing a tire and working around the store. By the second year, they're useful. But she can't hire them for the first year at $7.25. If she can't hire them for more than $7.25 because she would just lose money. So when you have an increase in the minimum wage, it doesn't hurt the employers. What it hurts is the unskilled workers who wouldn't get the job. One of the things I do, I should have brought some of these slides, but when I travel around, I often take pictures of these iPads in restaurants. It says, order on the iPad. Well, we never saw these, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. And some people might say, well, it's because there weren't any iPads 2 or 3 years ago. But it's also, if you artificially raise the wage, then an employer is going to take a look at an iPad, and he's going to put in place this technology. Even in Starbucks, you see order ahead on the mobile app. So now Starbucks, with its higher minimum wage, has cut the number of people in half. Because if you order ahead of time, that's one more action that the server doesn't have to take. All you do is you show up, you show them your smartphone, and you pick up your drink, and you pay. You don't have to use someone to order. So employers are going to do fine. Employers are going to adjust the technology. But the people who aren't going to do fine are these teenagers or unskilled people who actually want the job. Now, you had a second question.
Thank you. It actually goes with what you explained. You know, a lot of people that are getting minimum wage are people that are working for the government, especially not only people that are working qualified, they also regular people that Europeans are coming, you know, clean up and all this kind of stuff. And they have no way of getting any more money because the government will not give them more money unless the change. So, how would you
talking about civil servants?
What?
Are you talking about civil servants?
No, I'm talking about like if I would work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'd be getting as a lawyer.
I don't think that's going to find the lowest minimum wage.
No, it's not maybe lowest. If you get a minimum wage, also if you're very qualified, you want to work for the government. I'm saying not only that, maybe then you're doing it because you're an out, you have an ideology, whatever. I'm thinking about more people that work in cleaning up garbage in the Knesset. Okay, and they work for the government, and they won't get higher money because the government has no reason to give them any more money because they give them the minimum wage. So are you helping them get more money because the government has to have people to pick up the garbage?
Well, first of all, if the government is paying higher minimum wages, that results in a higher tax burden for all of you. All of you pay more for your taxes because these individuals have to be paid more than minimum wage. But secondly, there should be a more deregulated economy where people have the opportunity, say they get the first job, then they can go out and get the second job. It's very sad to have someone just tied to the government sector. I mean, presumably there are other private groups that need people to clean up, and you could move from, say, cleaning up in a small restaurant to working at the cash register to perhaps owning the restaurant later on. It's very important to have upward mobility, and a system where people cannot get their first job makes it a lot harder for them to get the second or third job. And it would be, even if these cleaners were paid minimum wage or a high minimum wage, it's still a big problem that they cannot find any other avenues for employment. Question over here.
Thank you. So I found your argument about implementing technology and then, you know, cutting down the amount of workers quite compelling, but I'm wondering, why wouldn't they do that regardless of whatever the minimum wage is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's an excellent question. But when you, the answer is that if you have a cost system where you can manage with your particular salary and you're making a particular amount of return and you're making a particular amount of profit on your investment, then you will continue to do that. Putting in place new technology is costly to begin with. You have to buy the iPads. You have to put everything up. You have to make the new system work. So you wouldn't automatically do that if you didn't have any choice. If everything's going along fine, you wouldn't make that extra investment in technology. What you find is that the higher the wage is, then the more you're going to invest in either technology or higher skilled people with a combination of the technology. And the result is that the lower skilled people get priced out. So with a $15 minimum wage, as some people want in the United States, there would be a law, in essence, that if you had skills under $15 an hour, you would not be allowed to work. It would be illegal for you to work. Now, it's just not realistic to think that if an employer has to pay $15 an hour, and he has a choice of a smart person with $15 an hour skills, or someone who has fewer skills and perhaps especially doesn't have language skills, then they will choose the person with the $15 an hour skills. And there won't be any room for people with lower skills. What's really important is to focus on how to get your first step in the labor force, and then also how to work up in the labor force and be able to increase. And with a first job, you can often improve your language skills. You figure out how things work. You have a reference from an employer who you can use to get your next job. Yes, question over here.
I believe that the salary should be reflected from partly from the cost of living. And in Israel, even though there is a minimum wage, so it doesn't like that. So if you claim that the wage is too high, so how many workers will manage if their salary is going to be much lower with the cost of living that's now in Israel? Or in other words,
no, that's an
maybe the minimum wage is not the only problem.
Right, that's a really excellent question. And in the United States, we've put in a system where low-income workers can get supplements from the government in order to help them. So there's one program called Earned Income Tax Credit, where if you earn below a certain amount of money, you get sent a check back when you file your tax return in April. There is also a program to give you medical care called Medicaid, where you have free medical care. And mostly in the United States, people pay for their medical care. So this is free medical care. There's also food stamps, where you get a debit card and you can use it as grocery stores to buy food. There's also a housing program called Section 8A housing vouchers, where you can get subsidized housing. These programs were put in place precisely so that employers would not have a disincentive to hire these low-skilled people. So the government is basically saying, hire these low-skilled people, pay them $7.25 an hour, and we will make sure that they will have the means to live with the earned income tax credit, the food stamps, the housing vouchers, and the medical care. But as it happens in the United States, we can look at, we have data, census data, and we can look at the average household income of a family with a minimum wage worker. And it turns out the average household income of a family with a minimum wage worker is $52,000 a year, which is above the average household income of $50,000 a year. Why is this? It's because often the minimum wage worker is a teen or someone who is supplementing other earnings in the family. The average household income of a family with a teen minimum wage worker is even higher, $62,000 a year. And the average income of a family with a minimum wage worker who's not a teen is $42,000 a year. Now, $42,000 a year certainly is not rich, but it's not the very lowest element of poverty either. The intersection between people who are poor and people who earn the minimum wage is very small in the United States. So there's about 47 million people who receive food stamps, who are on the food stamp program. Their income is low enough so they qualify for these debit cards that allow them to go to grocery stores and get free food at no cost. And the number of people on minimum wage is about 3 million. So there are a lot more poor people than there are people on minimum wage. And there are discussions, policy proposals about some kind of wage subsidy in the United States. One of my colleagues, Oren Cass, put forward a proposal that would automatically raise the wage from, say, $7.25 to about $12, with the difference being paid by the government. So the employer would be paying $7.25, an additional $5 would be paid by the government, so the person would come back with a paycheck for $12 an hour. Now, some of you might think this is a really good idea, and since this is my colleague and I'm on video, I should probably say it's a good idea too. But really, it has major disadvantages. First of all, he says that everybody should get this wage subsidy. But you again have the problem of these teens. It's not a problem. It's really great that these teens are going out and getting jobs. But a teen who is getting a $7.25 job, who comes from a household earning above average household income, should not have his wage bumped to $12 an hour. That's problem number one. Not everyone who is getting a low wage comes from a poor household, point one. Point two, this gives the employers big disincentives. So say an employer might have hired someone at $12 an hour. Then they think, oh, the government is going to bump the wage up to $12 an hour anyway. I'll just pay them $7.25. They're going to get the difference from the government. So you get an element of fraud in there that it's very, very difficult to police. And it's very difficult to say, I'm going to give everybody this difference without looking at their household incomes and seeing what situation they're in. That's why if the government is giving out money to help people be better off, it's important to look at the household income and see which households are in need of help rather than do it on an individual level. This is called a wage subsidy proposal. There's some presidential candidates who are coming out with a version of this that would exempt the lowest teen workers or something like that. But having this as a blanket policy does have very substantial problems in its implementation. Quite a lot of these ideas are very well-intentioned. All the people who propose these have the best of intentions. But in economics, we often see unintended consequences in the implementation of these. It results in, say, handicapped people losing their jobs or teens losing their jobs, things you wouldn't really expect to have happen. Question? Don't tell me you're in favor of the wage subsidy.
No, I'm not. In fact, this is more common. There's a massive inconsistency then in their message.
Who is there?
Somebody who would favor this wage subsidy. I presume that somebody who favors wage subsidy is also fairly sympathetic to the minimum wage itself. The argument...
Actually, I mean, he should be, but he is not. No.
Okay, but maybe in general.
Yeah.
But the argument from most people who favor minimum wage is that the demand curve is inelastic, and therefore increases in the wage will not cost a lot of jobs. It's basically an argument about the slope or the shape of the demand curve.
Exactly, and that's the argument.
If the demand curve is highly inelastic, and then you do a wage subsidy, all of that subsidy will end up lowering the wage. Almost all of it will end up at a lower wage. So if the demand curve is inelastic, as they suggest,
right,
this particular proposal will, most of that subsidy will just depress wages.
Right.
And the net effects of the worker will be very little.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So you can't really take one or two there.
No.
If you believe the demand curve is inelastic, then you have to own that.
Exactly.
So anyway, that's a very technical point, maybe,
Yeah.
but it's kind of surprising.
Yeah, no, it is surprising. Yes.
So you said the food stamps have 47 million?
47 million people Americans are on food stamps now. And what's really surprising about this recession, after most recessions, the number of people on food stamps peaks and then goes down. After the 2009 recession, it kept rising and has now stabilized at about 47 million people. Yes.
So isn't that not to be mean or gross, but isn't that a tax on those who are paying their taxes?
It does add to the tax payments, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if those are taxes that I'm paying for, you're
Right.
paying for.
And there's also a budget deficit, by the way, so that people in the future are also paying these taxes for to fund the 47 million people who are on food stamps.
We're good at that, at the budget deficit, I know that. On the other hand, isn't it a little, I don't know if hypocritical, but like to say it's not good to raise the minimum wage, which is what you said, because it hurts the people. But on the other hand, we have food stamps for the poor, so it's okay. But the food stamps is essentially the same thing. It's still a tax on me, right? If we raise the minimum wage, and as we said before, we pay all federal employees more money, so that's essentially a tax on me. But this is the same thing. It's still a tax on me. It's just a different name for it. It sounds a lot nicer if it's food stamps, so like I'm giving someone food. But isn't it the same thing?
Well, it's a great point. It's a very good point. But the reason it's not the same thing is that it doesn't give the employer an incentive not to hire that particular individual worker. And the thought is that this individual worker, he's, say, making $7.25. He gets the food stamps. He will be able to get a job the next year making $10 and the next year making $15. So he will eventually be off food stamps. If he's not hired at all, if he's completely unemployed, he has no chance to move up and then to be making an income that would allow him to be making tax payments to the government later on. So by taking a group of people completely out of the workforce, as Europe has done, by the way, with their young people, in Spain there's an unemployment rate of about 20 to 25% overall, but the youth unemployment rate reaches 50%. There are these individuals who think that they are never going to be able to find a pathway in the labor force. And that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid by having a high minimum wage. Labor regulations in Europe are extremely stringent. It's very difficult to fire people. You have to give them paid maternity leave, and employers are very unwilling to take people on. And the higher the mandates is not just the wage, but saying you have to give sick leave, you have to give maternity leave, you cannot fire somebody without a negotiation with the government or with the union. All this decreases the number of people that an employer wants to hire. And that means that it's much more difficult to get a job. It's more difficult to get into the labor market. And that's precisely what we want to avoid. Now, interestingly enough, by some measures, European productivity, measured very crudely as output per hour, is higher than in the United States. And one reason for this is that they have taken all the low-skilled people out of the labor force, and they said, well, you're not going to work, you're just permanently on government subsistence programs. Okay, it might look as though productivity is higher because output per hour is higher, but that's not the situation you want for a growing economy. And sure enough, growth rates in the European Union, in the different countries, are far lower than they are in the United States. Even though the United States only has 2.2% growth right now, growth rates in Europe are much lower. Yes?
Is there something that prevents businesses from to agree on a very low rate of payments for workers, so that workers basically can be used? What I'm trying to say is, what protects the unskilled workers from getting a very, very low salary?
So they're protected by their feet. In other words, if they're offered a low salary and they can get something higher elsewhere, they can walk to another employer, they can answer a help wanted sign, and then they can find another job. Their best protection is be able to walk off and go to another employer. That's why labor mobility is so important. That's why it's so important to amass skills, to finish high school, to get a college degree, to maybe even in some cases get a graduate degree, because each of those steps gives you more leverage with your employer. When your employer would offer you a low wage, you would say, no, I'm not going to take that because I have opportunities elsewhere. It's the opportunities elsewhere that prevent the employer from exploiting the worker and paying him a wage that is too low.
Can employers get together and agree on a certain industry or a certain area and agree on a very low pay?
If all the employers in the economy, just to do a thought experiment, were to do that, then I would suppose that's possible. But in practice, that doesn't happen. But Peter here has a comment.
Well, yeah, she's raising the question of monopoly power, right?
Right.
So the idea is that, and I think there was also one of the ideas in the original Kruger article, that basically there is a theoretical case for minimum wages if you can show that the workers have no other alternative buyers of their services. Yes, theoretically, if you can find a situation where for some reason there's only one buyer of your services or all the buyers are colluding, then also theoretically, by mandating a sort of minimum wage within a rather narrow range, you can show that the wage would go up and employment would go up. It's a very nice theoretical curiosity that gives you very satisfying results. But the point is, how likely is this? And how, I mean, do anybody take seriously that there's lack of competition among employers in the labor market in the United States?
Or anywhere else.
Or anywhere else.
And there's also the shadow economy. There's also the black market. I mean, say you could, say that might happen in, somewhere like the Soviet Union or North Korea or somewhere like that. There's probably some employer that would escape that and say, look, I really need somebody here. You got to come and do the job. It doesn't happen in practice. It can happen in an economics textbook, but it doesn't happen anywhere in practice. Yes, let's go down the list. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
So in recent years in Israel, there's been a separation between workers' output and their wages. Like the wages just stayed stagnant while output went up. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, if non-minimum wage went to help.
Okay, all right. So that's an average. So you might say average wages are the same when output went up. But first of all, you might be looking at just wage and salary income. First of all, most important, it doesn't relate a particular industry to a particular worker. You can't just be looking at these averages, because the output might have gone up, say, in the high-tech sector, and the wages might have gone up in the high-tech sector. But if you look at averages, it masks a lot of different things that are going on in the economy. So that's one problem. You need to be relating a particular wage in an industry to output in that industry. Second, wage and salary income is only a fraction of the total compensation package. So it could be, and you see this in the United States, that the value of health insurance and sick leave and vacation benefits has been going up higher than the cash wage. So the total benefit package in terms of employee compensation has been rising, but that isn't measured.
Another thing is, you said about 20% in Israel are working in minimum wage?
I estimated from the data that I could find, and the internet went off last night, so that wasn't so helpful, but 15 to 20%.
All right, so I think a lot of those people are
600
not
to
actually being
700,000.
directly employed by employers, but they're being employed through human resource companies, which are taking much more than minimum wage, but giving minimum wage without any social benefits to those workers. So it's not, so a raise of minimum wage wouldn't actually, it would reflect on the workers themselves and would take out of the cut of the human resource companies.
So we have to ask why is it that, say, these people get their initial job and then why don't they move on to other things, or why are these human resource companies so important? Why can't employers just hire individuals directly?
They won't, because they would need to provide them with social benefits, and through this human resource company, they can employ them and dispose of them, never give them pension, never give them anything. They're not obliged to them by anything. You said you were talking about the Thai workers, but who would replace them? And I wanted to hear your idea about the efficient worker model, like Henry Ford's, and how it correlates with minimum wage.
So Henry Ford became very successful, and he had to pay his workers more to attract them. I mean, you pay workers more not out of the kindness of your heart, but because you have to pay more to keep them. So there were headlines in the United States about Walmart, which is one of the United States' largest employers, raising their wage recently. And people asked, was this from a public relations perspective? Well, it was probably far more related to the fact that the unemployment rate was steadily falling through the 6s. Now it's 5.1, and they had to pay more to retain people. And these individuals who are being employed by these temporary help agencies, I would say that this is probably the best they can do at the present. But this gives them the experience to move to a better job. You can't think of one job just as the be-all and end-all. You have to think of it as one in a series of jobs in a career.
The problem is that the people that are retaining those services are for jobs that you don't have like an expertise. You don't get better at your job. If you're a cleaning person, you don't get better at cleaning as time progresses. I'll pay you double now because you're such a better cleaner. It's not the kind of personality you would want to pay more.
Right. Well, you can start as a cleaner and then go on to be a higher-end cleaner or some other kind of job afterwards. There isn't just one permanent job, or you can acquire more skills. The important thing is to be acquiring more skills, but it's better to be employed as a cleaner than not employed at all. That's what I would say. Yes. And by the way, Marco Rubio, who is a candidate for president, his mother was a cleaner and his father was a bartender. And he was sent to school, to university. He got elected to the Florida House, became Speaker of the Florida House, became a senator. When he was sworn in as a senator, he had $100,000 in student loans. And now he's running for president. So even if you start out as a cleaner, your children can still do better than you are. And we have a question from the professor here, so we're going to take the professor's comment before moving on.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on these employment agencies. It sounds to me like what's going on is that when you have a binding minimum wage, employers will look, since they can't afford workers with low skills, with the full benefit package, they can't cut the wage, but they can cut the benefit package. And this seems to be a legal dodge where they can cut the benefit package.
It's not so much as they can't afford it, as it gives them much more yeah, they can just fire them. They can make very sudden changes in the structure of the company, so they can cut back or add manpower at an instant without any cost.
There may be other advantages too, but if they need to reduce, if they don't want to pay more in total for the worker than the productivity that the worker is adding to the firm, cutting benefits is one way to do it.
It's also a problem that why can't the employer just fire suddenly? The employer's not allowed to do that, presumably, right? So they had a temporary help agency who can do it for them. So I mean, that's another problem. I mean, if there was a situation where the employer was allowed to fire somebody right away, they wouldn't go through the temporary help agency. Actually,
there's been fire, but he would have to pay them.
Well, that's the point. Yeah. So there's actually been an increase in temporary help agencies in the United States since the Affordable Care Act. The mandatory health insurance provision was put in place, which took effect in 2014. There are more companies that are going to these temporary help agencies because then they don't have to pay the costs of the health insurance and the Affordable Care Act.
But
so we're starting to see that. What?
They encourage poverty. The people that are working those jobs, they don't make ends meet. They work all 14 hours a day, but never get to actually live. they don't have money for rent, they don't have money for food, it's not enough. Like another person here said, minimum wage doesn't cut it, even if you work your ass off to be able to live normally.
Well, if the minimum wage were higher, they probably wouldn't get a job at all. As I said before, the idea is to get one job and be able to move on. But let's move on to the next question, because there's several questions.
I think all your talk was correlated to the American dream, because you said those jobs are typically just a start job and a way into the market.
Right.
But as a fact, in Israel, most of the people that are working for minimum wage, and I'm not talking about teenagers, they do lack of skills, and probably they will stay at this job for many years.
Right.
This will be their only opportunity in the job market. And for a fact, if they are now get paid the minimum wage, if there will not be a minimum wage, the market will pull down the prices and they will be paid less. Because as a fact, if not, they would be paid more than the minimum that is obligated.
Well, the minimum wage is higher in Israel than it is in the United States. It's also a higher percentage of median income. And I would argue that this is too high, this is too restrictive, and that there should, ideally, there would be no minimum wage at all. It would be eliminated.
But as a fact, people that I'm talking about like a normal household that two people are working for minimum wage. It's not enough in Israel. It's not enough for rent. It's not
right. It's not enough in the United States either.
Okay, so what can we offer those people? Because if you say we can eliminate the minimum wage, for sure they will get less money, and for sure they will not have another opportunities. I prefer to get money and not be out of the job, even if it's not a lot of money. And if I don't have another opportunity, and I can't just like take my feet and go to other people because I don't have the skill.
Well, I mean, that's one problem right there. I mean, people need to get more skills. We need to have more opportunities to train people than to just.
We still need people to work for this kind of jobs.
Let me tell you, there are many, many people who want to come to Israel to get cleaning jobs, and they would be paid far more than they would in the countries that they are leaving. And many of these people are being kept out,
right?
Because they can't come.
But I'm taking care of Israel, so I want to. Here, we can help.
You want to keep out the unskilled workers. Anyway, the solution to getting higher pay is higher skills, and there should be more training opportunities. You know, places where people can go to earn, to get skills in high return fields, which are computer programming or the healthcare professions such as nursing, occupational therapy, physical therapy. There needs to be more training programs if we're concerned about people earning too little money, which we all are. We need to be training them to earn more.
I still need people to clean this hotel. So it's my interest to keep people that their only job will be cleaning this place.
Yeah, but it might not be their interest. It might not be their interest.
Yeah, but I don't care.
Well, there are many people, there are many unskilled people who, as I said, want to come to take jobs in cleaning hotels. Next question, yeah. Did you have a question?
So, as you said at the beginning, only 25% of the people in Israel are getting paid with the minimum wage, and I think they are the main people to talk about, because, I mean, I know they just said it before, but I don't think that the prestige of jobs like cleaning the streets and like working in security and all that kind of jobs are gonna raise because of the higher minimum wage. And I mean, I don't think it's gonna change, and I don't think like I think that the opposite thing is gonna happen, that the students and educated people are gonna be overqualified for these jobs. This will be the problem. I don't think it's gonna damage the program.
Right. Yeah. So, no, I agree. Students and other educated people are going to be overqualified, and we need to be providing opportunities for them. You know, more startups, more innovations. We need to be liberalizing the economy so that more companies can be formed. There are about 15 families that own all the different companies here in Israel, I have been told by many different sources. and there is very little freedom of entry. If you want to start a new company in many areas, you are kept out of doing so. And there's also a fundamental problem that lowers employment opportunities. And we heard yesterday about the amount of time it takes to start businesses in different kinds of countries. We need to lower the time in Israel that it takes to start a business, so these businesses can start up, employ students. These businesses will also need to employ cleaners, by the way, and give more employment opportunities for everybody. This is something that can happen. We saw yesterday that it happened in Canada. We saw the Economic Freedom Index in Hong Kong. You are going to grow up and be very powerful and be in the government and be in positions of power where you are going to be able to make these things happen. And we shouldn't give up on these further employment opportunities and say some people are relegated all their lives to cleaning hotels. Yes?
But not all people, not just people, I mean, people who are getting low income or like a salary close to minimum wage, it's not just people who are cleaning the street. If you're taking care of you know, nursing children, you also get a minimum wage. And there are several other jobs, like a lot of different types of work that get minimum wage. And it's not just security and cleaning. So you have to give solutions to those people as well.
They have skills.
They have skills, but they get very low income. It's sometimes at minimum wage, sometimes it's a bit more than that. Teachers get salaries that are close to minimum wage.
On the monthly wage, yes, but not the hourly wage. The hourly wage of teacher in Israel is quite high.
The only way to deal with these problems is to have more economic growth, having a system that generates more economic growth, more companies founded, more jobs. I mean, imagine if the high-tech sector in Israel was expanded to the entire economy and it took over all this regulated economy. There would be faster economic growth and more sources of jobs. And these people who were teaching would then have other job opportunities.
But not everyone can work. I don't think that everyone can work in high-tech in computers. You have to have nurses, you have to have
people will
teachers.
still give services.
Yeah.
Right. Comment over here from the professor.
There's basically two forces that drive people's wages. At the top end is productivity. If you generate $10 an hour for an employer, that is the maximum that he will pay you. He'd like to pay you zero, maybe. But he will not pay you more than 10. 10 is what you generate for the employer. That is the top amount of wages you will get. So one way to raise wages is to increase that productivity. But there's another factor, and that is, what is your other opportunity? So suppose your next best job that you could find is 25 cents an hour. For whatever reason, maybe you're Ethiopian, and your best opportunity is to be in Ethiopia and make 25 cents an hour. You will, so you've got this gap. The way in which wages rise in economies is to raise both of these numbers. How do you raise productivity numbers? Well, through skill acquisition is one way, but also through capital accumulation and economic growth. But the bottom one gets raised primarily by increasing the number of job opportunities. If there are more employers around, they will bid up the wages, they'll bid up the opportunities for workers. So you get sort of two things that are going on at the same time.
But the raise of productivity also brings up the alternative, because people who are more productive get more money, they want to drink more coffee, get more cake.
The wages.
That's okay, that's fine.
Some
more coffee shops.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that you've got to do this. And actually, what happens in very competitive markets, the two numbers get very close to each other. Your next best alternative and your level of productivity is pretty much the same number. So that's what happens in Hong Kong. That's what happens in the United States. And as countries develop, you need to raise these numbers and they'll narrow. Unfortunately, raising the minimum wage to say $15 an hour. What does it do with $10 an hour work? No rational employer, period, will pay $15 an hour for someone who only generates $10 in revenue. In what world's view do you help someone by saying you can't work for $10 an hour, it has to be 15, when they don't generate? You don't make someone more productive by paying them more. You should make people paid more by making them more productive. So, you know, anyway, you got to think on both those margins to really get to this point.
But it's not that they're actually getting, the employer is paying 50, but the employee is getting 25 because the other 25 are going to the Furchtgott-Roth company. So he obviously evaluates the worker at 50. That's what he's willing to pay.
It's like minimum wage. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Why is it cutting out the minimum wage?
Can I say something about that?
Because the employers don't want to take them without a middleman. Then they have to get
because there's lack of flexibility. Because there's lack of flexibility, and because
No,
because
but
the employer has more flexibility if he has through the temp agency, because then he can fire them if he doesn't need them, and the labor regulations prevent him doing that. So that's a basic problem with labor regulations. Let me just go to you, and then I'm going to come back to you because I think you have a comment on this subject.
Yeah, just a quick thing. I think you're trying to fix the problem, but you will create a bigger one, because the fact we have these agencies is because we have a very defensive labor law in Israel. I mean, it's very hard for the employer to take a person in. So they take it from the outside, they outsource the employees. Now, if you will raise the minimum wage, that's exactly what's going to happen, but now you can't take it from the outside, you just have to break the law. So you will create a black market. I mean,
which,
you
by
need
the
to
way,
see this, if you look at it as a
by the
problem.
way, there already is, I understand, in Israel by many measures.
But what I'm trying to say is, the market fixed the problem that we created with the labor law by creating the agencies. So now you take the problem that you created by trying to defend the employees, and you will create an even bigger one. So for me, you see it from the wrong. I mean, the causality is wrong. You look at it and you're trying to fix something that we created by trying to do the same. So it's a cycle, and it's moving in the wrong direction, the way I see it.
But the fact that there are these labor agencies, these temp agencies, is a symptom of a larger problem. It's a symptom of over-regulation of the labor market, and they can't cut out the middleman, as Larry says, because it's just too costly and they don't have the flexibility. They're going to the temp agency for flexibility, just the way that temp agencies in the United States have picked up since this requirement that they have to pay either health insurance or a fine of $2,000 per worker per year. They have started going more to temp agencies for that reason. We have a question here.
So it's not as specific as the previous questions, but I wanted to address this whole theme of pick up your feet and move to the next job, or move on, or bring more workers from the outside. You said about there's plenty of other people in other countries who want to clean restrooms in Israel, so why not bring them? So even though I understand the economic logic here, of like having people move up the ranks, etc., instead of raising productivity by raising the cost of living, etc. But I think there's something here that doesn't really rub well both with Israeli mentality and the Israeli story, as well as with what people want. So with regards to what people want, I mean, all speakers here, or many of the speakers we always hear in economic school, are tenured professors. So I mean, the tenure has some sort of logic to itself in terms of economic freedom, but clearly people enjoy the idea of having a permanent job and having security.
Right. Well, so, tenure for professors is part of the compensation package, and it also means that they can write freely without being worried about being fired.
I understand, but some people don't.
Some people don't think that people should have tenure, but that's basically why it arose, and we can hear from Peter and Larry and Robert if they have any comments about that. But anyway, continue.
No, so just the point. I don't want to talk about tenure, etc. I'm just saying we can imagine the value of having a permanent job, and in different markets that could be different. There could be different reasons for that. So I understand why you want to encourage someone to get their McDonald's job and then move on to the next job. But McDonald's definitely benefits from the idea that you only work for us while you're a first job person. We don't pay you well. Move on. So it's not only there's an advantage to making your job seem temporary as opposed to making them seem like a real job. That's the first argument. And the second thing about Israel is not a country. I mean, the way most people envision Israel is not the way people envision America. Jewish Israelis tend to not want influxes of new workers unless they're Jewish. So if we don't have a lower class to bring in that's Jewish every time, we don't want low-paying workers. Now we're bringing them, but the question is, can economists offer us an internal model that'll keep people within this country occupying the lower jobs of society without being immigrants? Can we create a format where we have Jewish cleaner, or let's say Jewish, Arab, and whoever's here cleaning the houses, fixing stuff, etc., without immigration? That's a viable economic model.
Well, the concept of a job for life used to be in the United States also. Someone would say take a job with GM or in a factory, and then they would have that job for life. And that has since been replaced by a system where in practice people have multiple jobs, and they need to be skilled in terms of lifetime skills and have training and be able to be retrained and have the kind of skills where they can more easily adapt and go from one job to another. That has disadvantages, but it also has the disadvantage of not having the stability, but it has the advantage of, in essence, making it easier to move on if you don't like a particular job or if you want to move in a particular city. Now, as far as Israel goes, again, it all does come down to skills, and there are going to be people who are more low skill and who are going to want those cleaning jobs, whether it's Jews, whether it's Arabs, whether it's Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from Syria or Iraq or different kinds of places. And we can't really think, there really isn't a system where you would be paying low-skill jobs, cleaners, the amount that you would be paying someone like a computer programmer. You might implement more technology, such as have these robots that do the vacuuming for you, making people take out their own trash, doing away with some low-skill jobs. For example, in Europe, it's much harder to find your car parked. In Sweden, people don't hire house painters. They take a vacation and they paint the houses themselves because they can't get a low-skilled worker to do that. So it is a very different system, but I would say that that is not really a win-win. It's much better to get people who have lower skills to be able to get those jobs because it makes you, in the end, more productive, not having to take out your own trash, not having to take vacation to paint your own house.
But just, I mean, to me, I don't know how to interact with that idea. The way to describe Sweden rings a bell of like the way we imagine our society as it should be. Clearly, the way we're moving now, because we're not there yet.
Sorry, as it should be?
I think not economically. I'm giving you a sociological observation.
People should. No, but are you telling me people should take vacation to paint their own house?
I'm not from an economic perspective. That's not. You know a lot more than me, obviously. But if you ask people about their like kibbutz Israeli ethos, I think it rings a sociological bell. And I'm just saying, if you're not doing that in the country, you mentioned Jews from Arab countries, Jews from Ethiopia. We've depleted, so to speak, the reserves of Jews from less advanced countries, and everyone here is upwardly mobile. So really, there are no more poor Jews from Ethiopia to bring in, or poor Jews from Iraq, because people are on equal par here. They're living here and they're educated, and there's no lower class to bring anymore. So the option is either to bring in non-Jewish workers who haven't gotten their education, or to bring in, or to maintain a Dubai model or a Saudi, one of these like countries where there are a lot of workers without rights and sending them in and out, which is what we're doing now, which I don't think is good.
There's a lot of Arab workers who work in construction who would like other jobs too, and there's a lot of Arabs who are here illegally who would like to work, and it's very hard for them to get a work permit. So, on the gray market, on the black market, they work for a lot less. So there are these workers available.
And what do we do in 50 years?
I hope in 50 years there'll be peace with there'll be peace with the Arabs and people will coexist peacefully. And they're going to be unskilled workers in 50 years. And we don't know how technology is going to develop in 50 years also. Yeah.
What percentage of employees work for, I don't know what we're qualifying as gigantic retailers, but whether it's Nike or Gap or Walmart, or the largest McDonald's, what percentage of employees work for very large corporations?
I don't have that number for you. You have the number.
Almost all new jobs are created by small employers, but ironically, a large percentage of the workforce works for large employers. It's something on the order of 50% of the labor force in the United States works for firms with more than 10,000 employees. So it's pretty much.
So with that percentage, right, I assume that a very large part
I mean, there's actually a lot of turnover in those corporations too, by the way.
I would imagine
yeah.
People stay at McDonald's and Walmart job objectively forever.
It's not just a McDonald's or Walmart. There's something called the JOLT survey, Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, and it shows every year there's a labor force of about 155 million, and every year there's about 58 million people who leave their jobs and about 59 or 60 million who get new jobs. The whole workforce in the United States is in a big, there's a large amount of turnover. Once you go to one of those corporations, you don't just stay in that job.
So my question building on that, which is, how do you respond to someone who says the company makes billions of dollars in revenue, focusing on these large companies, whether it's Walmart, which makes $450 billion a year in revenue, which really is a lot less in profits, but even if let's say it was only $10 billion in profits, you could raise everyone's salary by $5,000, all their employees and all 2.2 billion of them, and that'd be a lot more money for those people who aren't making a lot of money. Or even McDonald's, the other franchises, there's plenty of money to go around. Why, I imagine the answer is with the shareholders, but the average person doesn't care about that answer, doesn't care that I'm going to stop.
Right.
So,
it has to do, first of all, one doesn't look at revenues, one looks at profits. And, but even then, it comes down to the skills and the productivity of a particular job. Just because a company makes a lot of money for its shareholders and investors as a whole doesn't mean that they would pay more for a job sweeping the floor or serving behind a counter. Because that's what that particular job produces. Peter.
Yeah, I mean,
and then last question from the professors. We won't let the students talk too.
There are only a limited number of places that other people that you can get money to pay these higher increasing wages. I mean, I think what some people are missing is you sort of understand the logic, but you don't really. People get paid according to what some employers think they're worth. In other words, it's all about what their value is. And passing minimum wage doesn't increase their value. You just pass a law. They were worth something to a particular employee before you passed the law. You passed the law that say they cannot work at a wage that is less than this amount, but you haven't changed their value to anyone. And you say you keep on coming back, or the argument keeps on coming back saying things like, well, people can't live on this wage, so therefore you pass a minimum wage. Well, what's the use of a minimum wage for a job that you can't get?
Okay. Question. Question over here. Oh, last question? Okay, two more questions very fast. One from you.
I feel the conversation is between two extreme points of view. 15 bucks an hour might be too much, but zero, I think, is not the right approach. Why not something in the middle, like 8,
right.
9?
Okay, yeah. Well, in practice, we do have something in the middle.
Yeah, but I feel like you're advocating that we don't need any minimum wage, and the other representatives too.
I would say that a wage agreement between two consenting adults, an employer and a worker, they should theoretically be able to decide themselves how much to work for. And theoretically, in an ideal society, there wouldn't be any minimum wage at all. But that is not the case of what we have right now. One more quick question. Yes, no.
Peter? Yesterday you said to us that the only interest of the employer is his own benefit. So I think that what the other students talked about is that the wages that they pay are so small because they just want to upper their profits, and this is the reason that they pay such small payment and salary, not because they value it less.
Well,
they value it. Yeah. It's the same thing. It's in their when they will pay according to how much they value the work.
And they can't pay too little because then the worker will go off and find another job. So the protection, they don't pay that because they are kind. They pay that because that's the least. They pay as little as they can to retain a particular worker.
Working with labor, with manpower firms are they don't have the ability to just, I don't know, take the prison, find another job, and they actually don't have those skills because they don't have the money to pay for the phony skills.
You don't help them by forcing the employer to pay them more.
Right, if all the employees pay them more, so they just don't have another choice.
But then there'd be more people who are unemployed. In other words, they would just, I mean, imagine you had to pay somebody $100,000 a year. Just imagine. Okay, well imagine you had to pay them, $50,000 a year. You can easily see that there would be a lot of people who just would not be employed. $50,000 is average household income in the United States. You might say, it's not fair to pay anyone less than average. We're going to have a law that says you have to pay everyone average $50,000. So you can easily imagine there would be a lot of people who just wouldn't be hired. That's also the case when you have a minimum wage that's less, say 10, 15, 20. So you can't imagine it by how much someone should be earning. It's like the New York Times reporter who wrote the series of articles that caused these manicure salons to close. These Vietnamese and Korean women without any language skills didn't have any jobs at all. She said the conditions are so bad. These people shouldn't be allowed to operate. They made these salons post what's called wage bonds, put up $25,000, paid $10,000 in case they were sued for $25,000. They went out of business. So these people didn't have any alternative at all. And it's true that this New York Times reporter, from her position in her nice office at the New York Times, said, well, this is a terrible job, people shouldn't be allowed to have it. But for those individuals, that was the only opportunities that they had. So that's the problem. So anyway, I look forward to continuing this discussion during